He lived quietly on the edge of a small town, in a modest house surrounded by trees that swayed gently with the wind. From the outside, he seemed like any other man. Calm, reserved, a face that rarely smiled, and eyes that looked straight through people without judgment. Most of the neighbors knew him as the quiet man who walked every morning, always at the same time with a dog by his side. The dog was large, strong, and alert. It moved with the precision of someone trained, though few understood how special it really was. The dog's name was Rex. To the man, Rex was more than a pet. He was a companion, a guardian, and sometimes the only friend he allowed himself to have. Every morning they would jog down the narrow paths that cut through the outskirts of the town. The townspeople would see them from afar, often whispering to one another, "That dog seems so disciplined," or "That man must have been in the army." No one was entirely wrong. There was something in the way he held himself, the way his eyes moved from shadow to shadow, always watching, always aware, that told you he was not just a simple man living a quiet life. His past, though, was a locked door he never opened. He had once served in places no one knew existed, in operations so secret that even speaking a single word could put someone in danger. He was part of an elite force, trained to make impossible decisions in impossible situations. Yet here he was, living in a small town, tending a small garden, fixing a squeaky gate, and spending long hours with Rex. The years of missions, danger, and loss had not left him bitter. They had left him careful, measured, and fiercely loyal to those few he allowed into his life. Rex had been with him for many years, and their bond went beyond the normal understanding of a pet and owner. The dog could read his expressions, sense his moods, and even anticipate his needs before he spoke. It was a partnership built over time, trust earned through patience and shared experiences. While the man often spoke little, his actions spoke volumes. When he returned from a long day of walking the streets or running errands, Rex would greet him at the door, tail wagging, ears alert, ready to follow him anywhere, to protect or simply to be near him. On one ordinary morning, the man woke earlier than usual. The sun had barely touched the horizon, and the air carried the sharpness of early autumn. He filled Rex's bowl with food, then attached the leash to his collar. The town was still asleep, and the streets were empty, save for the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call. As they jogged through the familiar paths, the man allowed himself to think. He thought of missions long past, of teammates he would never see again, of moments where every decision had been a matter of life or death. But those thoughts were quiet now, soft echoes in the background of a life that demanded little from him other than routine and care. Neighbors would occasionally peek through curtains, seeing them pass by. Children would wave, adults would nod politely, but few dared to approach. There was something in the man's presence that commanded respect without asking for it. Rex too drew attention. The dog's movements were precise, almost unnatural in their grace. Anyone who came close could see the intelligence in his eyes, the readiness in every muscle. It was a living reminder that some bonds were forged not only by love, but by shared discipline and understanding. Life, however, had a way of testing even the calmest of routines. That day, while the man was inside tending to chores, a sudden noise outside startled Rex. It was a small sound at first, a distant clap, a branch snapping, but it was enough. Rex bolted, his instincts kicking in before the man could even react. He ran toward the noise, barking loudly, moving faster than anyone could have anticipated. The man's heart jumped. "Rex!" he called. But the dog was already gone, disappearing between the trees and into the nearby street. Panic began to rise. He knew Rex was trained, disciplined, and would not attack unless provoked. But he also knew how others might perceive him. A dog of that size running alone could be mistaken for a threat, especially in a town where people were not familiar with his behavior. He grabbed his coat and ran outside, scanning the streets. "Rex, come back!" His voice echoed, but the dog remained out of reach, darting between shadows. Some neighbors had already noticed the commotion. A few stepped outside, curious, others cautious. One person had already called the authorities, reporting a large, aggressive dog running loose. Within minutes, he saw the flashing lights in the distance. His stomach tightened. He knew this could turn dangerous very quickly. Rex was now standing near the center of the street, growling at a passing car. The dog's posture was defensive, protective, but not aggressive toward people. The man waved his hands, trying to calm him from a distance. "Rex, sit. Good boy, come." His voice was firm but steady, the kind of calm that only someone who had faced life and death situations could produce. He hoped it would be enough. The officers arrived, moving cautiously. They had their weapons drawn, faces tight with concern. They shouted commands, trying to control the situation. "Get back. Stay there." Their voices were loud, sharp, and unnerving. Rex responded not with attack but with a protective stance, placing himself between the man and the approaching figures. He was alert, ready to defend if necessary, but his eyes always flicked to the man, seeking guidance. The man ran forward, hands raised, shouting, "Stop! Don't shoot! He's trained. He's friendly. Please wait." But fear often overpowers reason. The officers misread the situation, their nerves already frayed from past calls. They saw a large dog barking and growling, and interpreted it as a threat. The man's shouts blended with the wind, the tension thickening with every passing second. Then it happened. A sudden movement, a reflex, and shots rang out. The sound echoed, sharp and final. Rex fell. The man dropped to his knees, heart shattering in a silence that followed the chaos. The officers froze, realizing too late what they had done. The man's face remained calm, almost eerily so, but his eyes burned with a storm of grief, disbelief, and something else. A quiet fire that hinted at the depth of the bond they had just destroyed. Neighbors watched from a distance, some in shock, some crying quietly. The man did not scream, did not lash out. He reached for Rex, gently lifting his head, feeling the weight of his friend and protector. Tears rolled down his cheeks, but his hands were steady, stroking the dog's fur as if speaking to him in silence. Every touch, every breath was a conversation, a farewell. For a long moment, nothing moved. The man sat there, cradling his companion, surrounded by flashing lights, murmuring neighbors, and the heavy realization that a life so loyal had been ended in a mistake. He thought of all the years they had shared, the quiet mornings, the long walks, the trust that had been built slowly, patiently, and perfectly. Now it was gone, and the world seemed impossibly empty. People approached, some cautiously, some with apologies. The man did not speak much. He only nodded slightly, acknowledging their presence. Inside, however, memories surged like waves. Memories of missions, of loss, of comrades lost in battle. Yet none of it compared to the sudden, unthinking loss of a friend who had never failed him. Rex had never judged, never betrayed, always been there, steady and true. And now, that presence was gone. The officers stepped back, realizing the magnitude of what had happened. They had come to control a situation, to protect, but instead they had destroyed a bond that meant more than anyone there could understand. They did not yet know who the man truly was, nor did they realize the depth of his discipline, his training, his experience. To them, he was a quiet man overwhelmed by grief. To him, they were strangers who had made a permanent mark on his life. He stayed there for a long time, holding Rex, refusing to let go, refusing to let the world turn without acknowledging the loss. The wind moved through the trees, carrying with it a quiet sorrow. Neighbors gave him space, understanding in their own small ways, sensing that this was not a moment for words but for presence. The man whispered softly, not expecting an answer, "You did everything right. I'll never forget you." Eventually he rose, carrying Rex back into the house, closing the door on the outside world for a while. He sat in silence, the weight of his grief pressing down, yet within that grief there was a strange sense of control, a quiet steadiness born from years of discipline. This was not the man who would scream or lash out. This was a man who understood loss, who understood loyalty, and who would carry the memory of Rex in every step he took from that day forward. The town would remember the incident in its own way. A tragedy, a mistake, a warning about quick judgments. But for the man it was personal, intimate, a wound that cut deeper than words could describe. He thought of Rex's eyes, bright and trusting, and felt the absence of that trust like a physical ache. It was in that silence, in that moment, that the first stirrings of resolve began. He would honor his companion in a way that mattered. He would ensure that Rex's memory lived on, not just in his heart, but in the actions he would take, in the quiet strength he carried, and in the lessons the world might one day learn from the bond they shared. He did not yet know how or when or in what way. All he knew was that this quiet morning, this ordinary town, and this loyal dog had changed everything. And as he sat in the soft light of the room, staring at the still form of his friend, he understood something profound. Loyalty once given is never forgotten. Even when the world fails to recognize it, it leaves an imprint that can never be erased, and so, the quiet man sat there, holding Rex, and for the first time in a long while, allowed himself to feel the depth of what it meant to truly love, to truly lose, and to prepare silently for the days ahead, days in which memories would become action, and grief would become purpose. The day after Rex's death, the quiet man woke to a hollow silence that pressed on him from every corner of the house. The early sunlight spilled across the floor, but it offered no warmth. The absence of movement, the lack of a familiar nudge against his legs, and the silence of his once busy home made the world feel strangely empty. He went through the motions mechanically, brushing his teeth, making a small breakfast, and sitting by the window staring at the street. Every sound outside, every footstep made him flinch. He half expected Rex to appear, tail wagging, ready for their morning walk. But there was only the stillness, and with it the sharp ache of loss. Neighbors whispered behind curtains. Some knew what had happened. Others only caught fragments. A dog had been shot. A quiet man had knelt on the street, and the police had left with a strange tension around them. The man ignored them. He did not seek pity, nor did he crave their apologies. What he needed was understanding, and he knew very few people could offer that. He decided to go outside, despite the weight in his chest. The town had not changed. The same trees swayed in the wind, the same birds sang, and the streets looked just as ordinary. But everything felt sharper, more dangerous somehow, like the world had revealed a new layer that he had not noticed before. He walked slowly, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning everything. His senses, honed over years of service, had not dulled. Every movement, every sound, every shadow registered. It was a reflex, a muscle memory of years spent in situations where mistakes could cost lives. As he walked, he noticed a few officers lingering nearby, speaking quietly in low tones. Their eyes flicked toward him as he passed, but they did not approach. He could see the uncertainty in their posture, guilt, confusion, and a faint recognition that they had crossed a line they did not fully understand. He did not respond. He kept walking, shoulders straight, expression calm. To the casual observer, he appeared to be simply taking a morning stroll. To those who understood, there was a warning in the steadiness of his pace and the quiet focus of his gaze. Later, he visited the local police station. He did not raise his voice, did not demand answers. He approached the front desk calmly, politely asking to see the report from the previous day. The clerk hesitated, unsure how to respond. They had dealt with upset citizens before, but none like this man. He was composed, quiet, and there was a presence about him that made them uncomfortable. They shuffled papers nervously, trying to locate the report. The man waited, hands folded, expression unreadable. When the officer finally came to speak with him, they explained the procedure, trying to be thorough, cautious, and polite. He listened silently, asking only a few questions, the kind that required simple, factual answers. He took notes meticulously, noting every detail. He wanted to understand exactly what had happened, who had acted, and why. There was no shouting, no anger. But his calm was not weakness. There was a precision to it, a subtle authority that made the officers uncomfortable. They had dealt with many tense situations, but this was different. After leaving the station, he walked back through the streets, feeling the tension in the air. People stared as he passed. They whispered among themselves. They did not know his history, his training, or the discipline that ran through his veins like a quiet river. They saw only a man grieving a dog, and yet there was something else there, a sense that he was not to be underestimated. Back at home, he began to sort through Rex's things. The leash, the bowls, the toys, all carefully organized as if the dog might return at any moment. Each item carried memories. Each scent brought a rush of emotions he could barely contain. He touched them carefully, remembering the mornings when Rex had nudged him awake, the evenings when they had sat in silence together, the moments when the dog had sensed danger before he had. It was a routine, a ritual that had grounded him, and now the absence of it left a raw space in his life. In the afternoon, he decided to visit the spot where Rex had fallen. The street was quiet, the sun casting long shadows across the asphalt. He knelt, placing his hand on the ground, imagining the dog beside him. He spoke softly, almost to himself, almost as if expecting a reply. "You did your job well, Rex, you always did." He allowed the tears to come, not in bursts, but slowly, quietly. There was no sobbing, no loud grief, only a steady, deep sadness that pressed against him like the weight of the world. Neighbors who saw him passing by sensed the depth of his loss. Some approached hesitantly, offering words of comfort, though he rarely responded. He nodded politely, acknowledged their presence, but did not engage. Words were not what he needed. Actions, memories, and the silent acknowledgement of what had been lost were enough. He carried this weight with him as he returned home, each step measured, deliberate, controlled. That evening, he began to consider the implications of what had happened. He knew the officers had acted out of fear, misjudging Rex's behavior. But he also knew that mistakes had consequences, and that accountability mattered. He did not want revenge, not in the violent sense. What he wanted was justice, not only for Rex but for the understanding that loyalty, discipline, and careful action mattered in a world too quick to assume danger. He remembered the training, the years of missions where every decision had to be precise. He remembered the times when hesitation could cost lives, the times when control had been the difference between success and tragedy. Those lessons were not gone. They were part of him, embedded in every thought, every movement, every heartbeat. And now, they were focused on a single purpose: to ensure that the mistake of yesterday did not happen again, to prevent the loss of what mattered, and to honor the memory of a companion who had given everything without question. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork, conversations, and quiet observation. He visited the police station multiple times, asking for updates, following the case closely. He remained calm, polite, measured, but there was a quiet intensity in his presence that people could not ignore. Officers who had dismissed him before now found themselves paying attention, realizing that this man was not ordinary, that his composure was not fragile, and that his mind was sharp even in grief. At home, he began to organize Rex's belongings into a small memorial. Photographs, the leash, the toys, and a blanket that carried the dog's scent were carefully arranged. Each item was a memory, each memory a testament to the bond they had shared. He lit a small candle, letting the soft glow fill the room, and sat quietly, reflecting on the years they had spent together. It was a ritual, a way to honor what had been lost, and to remind himself that loyalty and love were never wasted, even in tragedy. One evening, a retired friend from his past visited him. The friend had known him during his time in service, had seen the discipline, the skill, and the quiet strength he carried. Seeing him now, sitting calmly among the memories of Rex, the friend did not speak at first. He understood. There was a bond between men who had faced danger together, a bond that did not require words. Finally, he spoke softly. "I'm sorry about Rex. He was a good dog." The man nodded, a small movement, acknowledging the words without needing them. "He was more than that," he said quietly. "He was part of everything I've tried to leave behind. And now he's gone." There was no bitterness, no rage, only a deep, controlled sadness. The friend understood. He knew that beneath the calm exterior, there was a storm of grief, loyalty, and memory. As the days passed, the town began to notice a change in the man. He no longer walked the streets with Rex. He no longer jogged through the paths that had once been their shared routine. Yet there was still a presence, a quiet force that could not be ignored. People whispered, speculated, and wondered about the depth of his past, the reason for the calm that seemed almost unnatural. But no one approached too closely. They sensed that this was a man who demanded respect not through words, but through his quiet authority, his discipline, and the weight of loss he carried with him. He began to focus on small actions that would honor Rex's memory. A local shelter received donations quietly and anonymously for dogs in need. Neighbors who once kept their distance now saw him helping quietly, leaving supplies or mending fences without asking for recognition. Each act was a tribute, a way to channel grief into purpose. It was subtle, almost invisible, but powerful. It reflected the lessons he had learned in his life. Loyalty, discipline, and careful action mattered more than words. And even in loss, one could create meaning. At night, he would sit by the window, staring at the streets, thinking of Rex, the memory of the dog's bark, the wagging tail, the alert stance, and it was all still alive in his mind. He spoke softly to the air as if Rex could hear him. "You were always perfect. I hope they know what they lost." There was no anger in his voice, only a quiet sorrow, deep and enduring. The days continued, each one a mix of reflection, quiet observation, and small acts of care. He understood the officers had acted in fear, not malice. He understood the world was often too quick to react without understanding. But he also knew that lessons had to be learned, that accountability was necessary, and that even in grief, one could act with purpose. His focus sharpened, not toward anger or revenge, but toward awareness, education, and honoring the loyalty that had been taken from him. By the end of the week, the quiet man had begun to plan. Not plans of confrontation, not plans of anger, but plans that carried the weight of his discipline and the clarity of his purpose. He would ensure that Rex's memory mattered, that mistakes were addressed, and that loyalty, trust, and careful judgment were never forgotten. It was a slow, methodical process, built on years of training, life experience, and the quiet understanding of loss. And in the quiet of his home, surrounded by memories of a dog who had been more than a companion, he allowed himself one thought, repeated quietly to himself each night. Loyalty is not forgotten. Not in life, not in death, and certainly not in memory. Rex had been perfect, and through that perfection, he would guide the man toward something greater, something that could honor what had been lost in a world too often blind to devotion and courage. The days passed slowly, each one stretching longer than the last. The quiet man continued his routines, walking through the town with measured steps, but the absence of Rex was a constant ache, like a shadow that refused to leave. His presence in the streets no longer drew just curiosity. It drew cautious glances, whispers of speculation. People sensed something deeper than grief, though they could not name it. There was a weight in his posture, a careful alertness in his movements, and a quiet intensity in his eyes that seemed to study everything and everyone without needing to speak. At home, he went through old letters, photographs, and mementos he had long kept tucked away. It was not nostalgia for itself, but a careful reflection on the life he had lived, the choices he had made, and the skills he had honed over years of service. Every photo, every medal, every note reminded him of who he had been and who he had chosen to become. A man of discipline, loyalty, and quiet strength. Rex had shared much of this life with him, a constant companion who understood instinctively the rules of patience, obedience, and protection. The dog's absence now left an emptiness that made even these memories bittersweet. One afternoon, a retired military friend came to visit. This friend had known him from years of shared missions, understood the discipline he carried, and had seen the depth of loyalty he demanded of himself and others. The friend studied him quietly as they sat in the living room. He saw a man shaped by experiences that few could imagine, a man whose calm exterior hid a torrent of loss, and whose measured actions were forged in circumstances most would never endure. "I've been thinking about Rex," the man said softly, his voice barely above the hum of the wind outside. "He wasn't just a dog. He was part of everything I've built to keep myself grounded. And now—" He paused, letting the weight of the sentence hang. "Now he's gone." There was no bitterness, no anger, only a steady, deep sadness that pressed like a physical presence in the room. The friend nodded, understanding instantly. He had seen this man face danger countless times, and had never witnessed his composure falter, yet the absence of Rex had cracked something, subtle but profound. "It's going to be all right," the friend said gently. "You've faced worse," but the man shook his head. "No, this isn't about danger. This isn't about missions or threats. This is about something I trusted. And that trust, it's gone." The conversation turned to the officers involved, and the man spoke carefully with precision. He did not raise his voice, did not threaten. He asked questions, sought details, and outlined what had occurred with calm clarity. The friend listened, impressed by the methodical approach, recognizing the careful calculation of someone who had been trained to assess every detail, every possibility, every outcome. It was a skill he had used countless times in operations that demanded life or death precision, now applied to a situation he had hoped never to face. As word of the incident spread, the local police department began to take notice. Some officers whispered among themselves, recalling the calm composure of the man as he interacted with them. They remembered the steady gaze, the quiet authority that did not demand respect but commanded it nonetheless. Rumors began to circulate quietly at first, that perhaps this was not an ordinary citizen, that there might be a deeper history behind the man who had lost a dog in a tragic accident. One afternoon, the police chief called in a few senior officers to review the case. He had received a note from the department asking for further information on the man. Curiosity mixed with concern as they pulled files and ran checks. Slowly, they discovered fragments of his past, service records, mission briefings, and notes that hinted at something extraordinary. The name triggered recognition in certain circles. It was not a name widely known to the public, but to those who had worked in special operations, it carried weight. He was a man who had led missions that required skill, courage, and judgment beyond most soldiers' reach. The officers began to feel a shift in perspective. The man they had assumed was simply grieving a dog was, in fact, someone whose life had been shaped by experiences few could comprehend. The realization was accompanied by guilt and embarrassment. They had acted in fear, misreading a situation they did not understand. And now they faced a stark truth. They had harmed someone extraordinary, someone who demanded nothing less than respect, yet deserved far more consideration than they had given. Meanwhile, the man remained composed. He did not seek confrontation. He did not demand acknowledgement or apology. Instead, he focused on understanding the incident fully and ensuring that the lessons from it would lead to meaningful change. He spoke quietly with the department, offering insight on handling situations involving trained animals, emphasizing patience, observation, and careful judgment. His words were calm, precise, and unwavering. There was a discipline to his tone that left no room for argument, and the officers listened, realizing that the quiet man before them carried wisdom, forged through experience that far surpassed their own. As the investigation continued, the town began to notice subtle changes. The quiet man's presence was felt in new ways. Neighbors observed him quietly assisting at shelters, leaving food and supplies for animals, and speaking softly to children about responsibility and care. These acts, small but significant, reflected his understanding that even in loss one could create meaning and purpose. It was not revenge, nor was it display. It was a way to honor what had been lost, to transform grief into action, and to remind others of the power of loyalty and responsibility. At home, he continued to reflect. Nights were the hardest. He would sit by the window, staring at the streets where he and Rex had once walked, recalling every sound, every movement, every small ritual they had shared. The memories were vivid and precise. The way Rex tilted his head when he was curious, the slight pause before running, the alertness that had saved them both from small dangers countless times. These memories were both comforting and painful, a reminder of what had been lost and what still remained in the quiet corners of his mind. Occasionally, he would leave the house and visit the site where Rex had fallen. He did not go for confrontation or spectacle. He went to observe, to reflect, and to feel the presence of a companion who had been more than just a dog. He would kneel quietly, run his hand over the ground, and whisper memories aloud. "You always knew," he said one evening, voice soft. "You always knew when to act, when to wait. You never failed me." The words carried no anger, only deep acknowledgement. Passers-by might have seen only a man kneeling in silence, but those who understood could sense the bond, the respect, and the love that had endured beyond death. The police department continued its review, and eventually, the chief decided it was necessary to meet with the man personally. He arrived at the quiet man's home, a mix of anxiety and respect in his posture. They spoke at length, the chief apologizing for the tragedy, acknowledging the misjudgment and listening as the man outlined what had occurred. The conversation was measured, controlled, and thorough. There was no shouting, no accusation, only clear statements, observations, and expectations for how similar incidents could be avoided in the future. As the discussion ended, the chief realized the depth of his own ignorance. He had seen a situation in a narrow context, missing the nuances, the history, and the loyalty that had defined the man before him. The quiet man's approach was a lesson in patience, awareness, and the careful application of judgment. The chief left with a sense of humility, understanding that this encounter would remain with him as a reminder of the value of observation and reflection before action. Over the next weeks, the quiet man began to extend his influence quietly but effectively. He spoke with local authorities about training for handling animals, emphasizing empathy, observation, and clear communication. He organized small workshops attended by officers and community members, teaching lessons drawn from his own life: discipline, patience, loyalty, and the understanding that fear often leads to mistakes. His teachings were subtle, grounded in human experience, and carried the weight of authenticity that could not be ignored. At home, he continued to honor Rex's memory through daily routines. He maintained a quiet vigil over the dog's belongings, keeping them arranged with care and respect. Each photograph, each toy, each item of clothing carried the imprint of their shared life. In the evenings, he would sit by the window, reflecting and planning for the future. He considered starting an organization for service dogs or perhaps offering training for families and officers, ensuring that other animals would not meet the same tragic fate. Every thought was measured, deliberate, and imbued with the purpose of transforming grief into something constructive. He remained cautious of neighbors, but some began to approach him differently. They noticed his actions, the calm authority in his demeanor, and the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him. Children began to feel safer in his presence, sensing the discipline and care that defined him. Adults began to speak in hushed tones, respecting the depth of his experience without fully understanding it. Even the officers who had been involved in the incident treated him with a new level of awareness and respect, realizing that the quiet man they had underestimated was someone whose past and skills could not be measured in ordinary terms. One evening, he received a letter from an old military colleague, expressing concern and admiration for how he had handled the situation. The colleague praised his restraint, his clarity, and the dignity with which he navigated loss. The quiet man read the letter slowly, absorbing the words, yet he did not respond with pride. Instead, he allowed the words to settle in, reinforcing the understanding that true strength lies in measured action, loyalty, and the quiet application of skill, rather than in display or confrontation. As part 3 of his story came to a close, the quiet man had transformed his grief into purpose. The town had begun to see him differently. Authorities had begun to recognize the depth of his experience, and the memory of Rex continued to guide every action. He remained disciplined, quiet, and deeply human, embodying a balance between loss and resilience that few could understand. The days ahead would be shaped by the lessons of the past, the loyalty of a companion lost too soon, and the deliberate, careful actions of a man who had lived through extraordinary circumstances and chosen to meet the world with clarity, patience, and purpose. The quiet man spent his days observing the town from a distance, taking note of small details that others overlooked. The world around him moved in its usual rhythm, but he could feel the subtle shifts that came with the aftermath of the incident. The officers who had been involved in Rex's death now approached him with caution, their voices lower, their gestures more measured. There was a growing awareness among them that this man was not ordinary, that beneath his calm exterior lay a mind trained for precision, discipline, and understanding consequences in ways most could not comprehend. The town itself began to whisper. Stories circulated in muted tones about the quiet man who had lost his dog, the way he carried himself, and the presence that seemed to command respect without a single word. Some neighbors speculated about his past, recalling how few people he let into his life, how disciplined his routines were, and how careful his movements had always seemed. Others simply watched, sensing that there was more to this man than met the eye, though they could not put their finger on it. At home, he continued his quiet routines. He cleaned, organized, and prepared, each action deliberate and precise. He maintained Rex's belongings with care, ensuring every item was in its proper place. The leash, the toys, the photographs. Each one held memories that he honored silently. At night, he would sit by the window, gazing at the street where Rex had fallen, reflecting on the events that had unfolded and the lessons he could impart from them. This reflection was not driven by anger, but by a determination to transform grief into something meaningful. He began to take steps to ensure that the tragedy would not happen again. He contacted local animal organizations, offering guidance on training, safety, and awareness. He spoke with officers about how to handle animals in high-stress situations, emphasizing patience, observation, and calm decision-making. He did not demand attention or recognition, but his presence carried weight. People began to listen, recognizing the clarity and authority in his words. They could see that his experiences had given him insights that were rare and valuable, and that his approach was grounded in both discipline and compassion. The police department, now fully aware of his background, approached him with a new perspective. Senior officers met with him to discuss training programs and protocols, listening as he detailed steps that could prevent future incidents. He spoke carefully, outlining scenarios, responses, and strategies, all rooted in his years of experience in special operations. There was no arrogance in his voice, no demand for praise. He was focused entirely on improving understanding, fostering respect, and ensuring that mistakes were not repeated. Despite his composure, there were moments when the grief surfaced. At night, he would sit quietly, holding Rex's blanket, remembering the dog's alert eyes, the wag of his tail, the small gestures that had meant so much. He allowed himself to feel the loss fully, without distraction, and without attempting to mask it. This process of reflection and acceptance became part of his healing, a way to honor the bond he had shared and to acknowledge the depth of what had been taken from him. The town's perception of him began to shift. Children who once avoided him now approached more confidently, sensing the gentleness beneath his discipline. Adults spoke of his quiet contributions, leaving supplies for animals, volunteering at shelters, and assisting neighbors without seeking acknowledgement. Even the officers involved in the incident began to treat him with a level of respect they had not shown before, recognizing that the man they had underestimated was someone whose experiences had shaped a perspective far beyond their understanding. One afternoon, the man received an unexpected visitor, an officer who had been on the street the day Rex was killed. The officer approached cautiously, unsure how to begin, but the man welcomed him silently, gesturing for him to sit. The conversation started quietly, with the officer explaining his side, acknowledging the fear, and expressing regret. The quiet man listened, nodding occasionally, but said little. When he spoke, it was measured and calm. He emphasized understanding, training, and patience. There was no accusation, no harshness, only guidance drawn from a life spent making critical decisions under pressure. The officer left with a new understanding. He had witnessed the quiet man's approach, the calm authority in his demeanor, and the depth of his insight. It was a lesson in humility and perspective, one that would shape his actions in the future. For the quiet man, it was a small step toward restoring balance, a way to turn the tragedy into an opportunity for learning and growth. As the days continued, he began to focus on broader initiatives. He worked quietly to establish programs for training dogs, particularly those who would assist in service roles. He shared his knowledge with handlers, families, and organizations, emphasizing the importance of discipline, observation, and mutual trust. His experience in high-pressure environments informed his approach, allowing him to create protocols that were practical, humane, and effective. Through these efforts, he found a way to channel his grief into constructive action, ensuring that Rex's memory would continue to make a positive impact. He also took time to reconnect with the natural rhythms of his life. Walks became meditative, moments of silence allowed for reflection, and small acts of care grounded him in the present. He maintained a quiet vigilance over the streets he once walked with Rex, observing interactions, noting behaviors, and learning from the world around him. His awareness was sharp, but it was tempered by compassion and understanding, a balance that reflected both his past experiences and his desire to foster positive change. Neighbors began to approach him differently. They sought guidance on animal care, observed his routines with curiosity, and gradually began to understand the depth of his knowledge and experience. Children felt safer, adults more respectful, and the officers who had once underestimated him now treated him with caution and deference. The quiet man did not seek recognition, but it naturally followed from the authenticity of his actions and the integrity with which he conducted himself. At home, he continued to honor Rex's memory in subtle ways. He kept a journal, recording observations, lessons learned, and reflections on his own behavior. Each entry was precise, thoughtful, and deliberate, reflecting the careful attention to detail that had defined his life. He also maintained a small memorial for Rex, arranging the dog's belongings with care, lighting candles, and allowing himself moments of quiet remembrance. These rituals grounded him, providing both solace and a framework for moving forward. One evening, he received a call from a local community leader who had heard about his initiatives. The leader invited him to speak at a small gathering, emphasizing the importance of training, awareness, and empathy in handling animals. The quiet man agreed, preparing carefully for his presentation. He did not seek attention, but he recognized the opportunity to share his knowledge and to prevent future tragedies. The event was modest, but his words carried weight. Attendees listened intently, absorbing his lessons, and leaving with a new understanding of responsibility, trust, and careful judgment. Through these efforts, the quiet man began to see a shift not only in the town but in himself. The raw edge of grief softened, replaced by purpose and determination. He understood that while Rex was gone, the dog's influence and the lessons they had shared could continue to guide him and others. This realization brought a sense of peace, tempered by the acknowledgement of loss and a recognition that even in tragedy, one could create meaning and positive change. The officers involved in the incident continued to interact with him in new ways. They sought his advice, observed his methods, and began to implement his suggestions in their training. The quiet man offered guidance without judgment, focusing on education and awareness. His approach was calm, methodical, and effective, reflecting the discipline that had defined his life and the empathy that had guided his actions. Neighbors also began to notice small changes in their own behavior. They observed the way he treated animals, the patience he exhibited in daily interactions, and the careful attention he paid to the world around him. Some began to adopt his methods in their own homes, applying lessons of trust, observation, and discipline in ways that improved their own lives. The quiet man did not seek credit. He simply acted with integrity, allowing his example to speak for itself. At night, he continued to reflect. He sat by the window, thinking of Rex, of the bond they had shared, and of the lessons that loss had taught him. He allowed himself to grieve, but he also allowed himself to plan, to strategize, and to act with purpose. He understood that his past experiences had prepared him for moments like these, moments where calm, precision, and careful observation were essential. He drew strength from these memories and from the quiet knowledge that loyalty once given could never be forgotten. The quiet man also began to mentor others, offering guidance to those who sought it. He shared stories of discipline, trust, and responsibility, always in measured tones, never seeking admiration, only understanding. His influence grew subtly, reaching beyond the immediate circle of neighbors and officers to touch the wider community. Through these efforts, he transformed the tragedy of Rex's death into a force for positive change, demonstrating that even loss could be a catalyst for growth, learning, and resilience. As Part 4 progressed, it became clear that the quiet man had not only survived the incident, but had used it to redefine his role in the community. He remained disciplined, thoughtful, and deeply human, embodying a balance between grief and purpose that few could fully comprehend. The officers who had once misjudged him now recognized the depth of his experience and the clarity of his judgment. The town, too, began to see him as a figure of wisdom and authority, someone whose calm presence and thoughtful actions could guide others in both ordinary and challenging circumstances. Through it all, Rex's memory remained central. The dog's loyalty, intelligence, and unwavering companionship continued to influence the quiet man's decisions, actions, and approach to the world. Every choice he made, every lesson he shared, and every moment of reflection was infused with the presence of his lost companion. It was a bond that transcended death, a reminder that true loyalty endures even when the one who embodies it is no longer physically present. By the end of this chapter, the quiet man had established a framework of influence, education, and careful observation that reached throughout the town. He had transformed personal grief into collective awareness, ensuring that the lessons of Rex's life and death would continue to resonate. He remained calm, composed, and deeply human, a figure whose quiet strength and deliberate actions inspired respect, understanding, and admiration. The days ahead would continue to test him, but he was prepared. He understood the value of patience, the power of careful action, and the enduring significance of loyalty. Through his work, his reflection, and his quiet presence, he ensured that Rex's memory lived on, shaping not only his own life but the lives of all those who observed, listened, and learned from him. The quiet man awoke early, as he always did, but this morning carried a different weight. The grief that had pressed so heavily on him in the days after Rex's death was still there, but it had shifted. It no longer held him in a crushing grip. Instead, it was sharper, clearer, focused into something purposeful. He moved through the house with deliberate motions, checking the small memorial he had built for Rex, arranging the items carefully. Every piece, every photograph, every toy told a story, reminded him of the bond they had shared, and kept alive the memory of loyalty that had once walked beside him every day. He stepped outside and walked along the familiar streets of the town. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. People began to stir, children running to the school bus, neighbors greeting one another. Some noticed him walking quietly, observing the world with careful attention, and felt a subtle respect, a sense that this man had lived more than most could imagine. They whispered among themselves, speculating about his past, about his discipline, and about the calm authority that seemed to flow from him effortlessly. The town had changed too. The incident with Rex had left a mark that could not be ignored. Officers moved with more caution when dealing with animals, parents were more vigilant with their children, and neighbors began to consider the importance of trust, patience, and understanding. The quiet man had become a catalyst for change without ever seeking it. His presence alone taught lessons that words often failed to convey. At home, he spent long hours writing and planning. The journal he had begun months ago was now filled with observations, reflections, and lessons. He had recorded everything: the way Rex had responded to commands, the subtle signals that had kept them safe, and the missteps of the officers that had led to the tragedy. Each note was precise, clear, and deliberate. They were not just memories. They were tools for teaching, a record of loyalty and trust that he intended to share with others to prevent similar losses. One afternoon, he received a call from a local youth center. They had heard about his work with animal safety and training, and invited him to speak to a small group of teenagers. The quiet man agreed, seeing this as an opportunity to guide the next generation with the lessons he had learned. He arrived at the center calmly, carrying with him only a small bag containing notes and a few items that once belonged to Rex. The teens looked at him curiously, sensing the quiet intensity in his demeanor, but also feeling the warmth and authenticity in his presence. He began to speak softly, explaining the importance of trust and responsibility when caring for animals. He told them stories about Rex, not just as a dog, but as a companion who had been loyal, disciplined, and intelligent beyond words. The teens listened, captivated by the combination of personal experience and practical advice. He did not lecture or preach. He simply shared his life, allowing the lessons to emerge naturally. By the end of the session, the teens left with a deeper understanding of empathy, patience, and the careful attention required to build bonds that mattered. Back at home, he reflected on the session, feeling a quiet satisfaction. The work he was doing now was different from his missions in the past, but it was no less important. It carried purpose, responsibility, and the ability to impact lives in ways that were tangible and lasting. Rex's memory continued to guide him, shaping the way he approached teaching, observation, and action. Every decision was measured, deliberate, and informed by the bond he had shared with his companion. The officers who had once underestimated him now approached with a level of respect that had taken time to develop. Some sought his guidance, asking how to handle situations involving animals or high-stress encounters. He responded with calm clarity, emphasizing observation, patience, and careful decision-making. He did not flaunt his past or demand recognition, but his expertise was undeniable. Slowly, the department adopted his recommendations, improving protocols and training methods that would prevent future tragedies. Even neighbors began to notice subtle changes in their own behavior. They observed his routines, his careful attention to animals, and the patience he exhibited in daily interactions. Some began applying similar principles in their homes, learning to communicate more effectively with their pets and to respect the instincts and intelligence of the animals around them. The quiet man's influence spread quietly but powerfully, a testament to the enduring impact of example over instruction. One evening, he sat by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The streets were quiet, and the wind carried the familiar scent of the town he had called home for years. He thought of Rex, of the countless walks, the playful moments, the alerts and signals that had guided them both. He spoke softly, not expecting a response, but feeling the presence of his companion in the space around him. "You taught me everything," he whispered. "I'll carry it forward always."